Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating and lesser-known stories of the Middle Ages. Have you ever imagined Vikings navigating the rivers of Russia until they reached the heart of the Islamic world? Or Arab merchants traveling through the frozen north to trade with Nordic warriors? Well, it really happened. And it changed the world in ways we still feel today. Stay with me, because this journey will take you through forgotten trade routes, unlikely cultural encounters, and a bridge between two worlds that seemed impossible to connect. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. When two worlds met in the northern waters, imagine the 9th century. The known world was divided into cultural bubbles that rarely touched. In northern Europe, the Vikings, or Varangians as they were called in the east, dominated the seas and rivers with their elegant drac cars. In the south, the Abbasid Caliphate was living its golden age in Baghdad, a city that shone like a jewel in the desert, a center of science, art, and commerce. Between these two worlds, there were thousands of kilometers of dense forests, endless steppes, and powerful rivers. It seemed impossible that these two cultures would meet, but history, as always, has its surprises. It was the year 839, and the Volga River flowed silently through lands we now know as Russia. Its dark waters reflected the cloudy northern sky, and its banks were covered by forests of birches and pines that seemed to stretch to infinity. The smell of wet earth and moss hung in the air, mixed with the scent of tree resin. It was a world of green and grey tones, where silence was only broken by birdsong and the whisper of wind through the leaves. But on that day, something different cut through the waters of the Volga. Long, narrow boats with ornate prows glided downstream with an almost supernatural grace. Inside them, tall men with blonde and red hair rode in perfect synchrony. They were the Russi, Vikings who had decided to trade the open sea for the rivers of the east. These men weren't just exploring. They were searching for something worth more than gold, trade routes that would lead them to the legends they heard in Scandinavian taverns. Stories about cities where knowledge flowed like water, where merchants sold spices that perfumed entire palaces, and where silver was so abundant that people used it even in their clothing. Curious how the search for wealth can unite cultures that didn't even know of each other's existence, isn't it? But the path wasn't easy. The Volga route, as it would come to be known, was a journey of months. After weeks navigating upstream and downstream, carrying their boats overland when necessary, a technique called portage that required superhuman strength, the Vikings finally reached the lands dominated by the Khazars, a semi-nomadic people who controlled the lower Volga. The Khazars were fascinating intermediaries. Their empire, the Khazar Khaganate, was a bridge between north and south. And here's a curiosity that few know. The Khazars had adopted Judaism in the 8th century, becoming one of the few empires with this religious tradition in history. Just imagine the scene: pagan Vikings trading with Jewish merchants on the shores of the Caspian Sea, while Muslim caravans arrived from the south with silk fabrics and spices. It was a cultural melting pot like few in history. And have you ever stopped to think what it would be like to be at that crossroads of cultures? 3 religions, dozens of languages, hundreds of traditions, all coexisting because trade made the impossible possible. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. The Vikings continued their journey. After crossing Khazar territory and establishing commercial agreements, they finally reached the Caspian Sea. And here began the truly extraordinary part of the voyage. On the other side of that inland sea, the lands of the Abbasid Caliphate awaited. Cities like Baghdad, but also smaller commercial centers along the Persian routes. And it was in these places that the true encounter happened. The Arabs looked at those men from the north with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and traveler who encountered the Rus in the year 922, left a detailed account that survives to this day. And his words give us a fascinating window into this moment. He described the Rus as impressive in stature and appearance, tall with fair hair, but also noted cultural practices that differed completely from Islamic ones. Their distinct religious customs, their social traditions, their decorative body markings that covered their arms and necks. But beyond the initial differences, something deeper was happening. Exchanges, not just of goods but of ideas, techniques, words. The Vikings brought South Fox and Marten furs, Baltic amber, products from northern lands, honey and beeswax, rare and valuable goods in the Islamic world. In return, they received silver, tons of silver. And here's something fascinating. To this day, archaeologists find Arab coins, dirhams, buried in treasures in Scandinavia, thousands of them. Some have been found in Sweden, others in Norway, many in Denmark. Each of these coins is silent proof of this encounter between the desert and the forest. But what happened when these two cultures really began to understand each other? When words replaced distrust? Well, that's when the story gets even more interesting. Silver, silk, and words, the market where worlds crossed. The first time a Viking saw Baghdad must have been a moment of pure astonishment. Imagine, you spend months crossing dark forests and icy rivers where the largest construction you know is a wooden hall with a thatched roof, and suddenly before your eyes appears a city of 1 million inhabitants. Yes, 1 million, when London barely had 10,000 people. Baghdad's walls gleamed under the desert sun, built of bricks that reflected shades of ochre and gold. The Tigris cut through the city like an artery of life, its waters carrying boats of all shapes and sizes. The air was hot and dry, completely different from Nordic humidity, and carried aromas the Vikings had never smelled before. Cinnamon, saffron, incense, rose. In the streets, the sound was a chaotic symphony, merchants shouting their offers in Arabic, Persian, Greek, the clinking of coins, the echo of horse hooves on stones, calls to prayer echoing from minarets. It was a world so different from the silence of Nordic forests that some Vikings must have wondered if they hadn't entered some kind of dream. But these weren't dreams. It was the reality of an empire at the height of its power. The markets, or souks, were the beating heart of this reality. Covered corridors stretched for kilometers, creating a labyrinth of commerce where practically everything in the known world was available. Spices from the Indies, silk from China, ivory from Africa, glass from Syria, carpets from Persia. And now, with the arrival of the Rus, furs and amber from the north. It's fascinating to think about it, isn't it? How a piece of fossilized amber in the Baltic could end up in the hands of a caliph in Baghdad, passing through dozens of intermediaries and thousands of kilometers. The Vikings quickly realized they had found something extraordinary. Silver flowed in the Abbasid Caliphate like water in a river. Mines in Central Asia, tributes from distant provinces, resources from different territories. Everything converged on Baghdad's coffers, and the caliphs, in their infinite need for exotic luxuries, were more than willing to pay well for Nordic products. But here's the interesting detail. The Vikings didn't just sell and go back, many stayed. They learned Arabic. Some adopted local customs to facilitate business, married local women, established themselves as permanent merchants. And this permanence created something unique, a class of cultural intermediaries. Men who spoke both Norse and Arabic, who knew both the sagas of Odin and the principles of Islam, who could negotiate in Novgorod in the morning and in Isfahan in the afternoon. Well, not literally, but you get the idea. Ibn Fadlan, that Arab diplomat we mentioned in the previous chapter, left us a fascinating portrait of these encounters. In 921-922, he was sent by the Caliph of Baghdad on a diplomatic mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars, another people who served as a bridge between north and south, and along the way he met the Rus. His descriptions are detailed and revealing. He admired the Vikings' physical appearance, people of impressive stature, he wrote, but was intrigued by cultural practices very different from his own. He recorded the funeral ceremonies of the Rus, rituals that reflected their deep beliefs about the journey beyond life, where companions followed together to the other world. For Ibn Fadlan, educated in Islamic values, this represented a completely distinct worldview. But beyond the cultural differences, Ibn Fadlan also recorded something more important. Trade worked. Despite the immense differences, religious, cultural, linguistic, the two civilizations found a common language in the market. What do you think this teaches us about human nature? That mutual interest can overcome almost any barrier. The silver coins minted in the Caliphate, the famous dirhams, began to flow north in impressive quantities. Modern archaeologists estimate that hundreds of thousands of these coins reached Scandinavia between the 9th and 11th centuries. Some were melted down and transformed into jewelry, others were cut into pieces to serve as payment, the famous hack silver. Many were simply buried as treasure. And these coins tell a story. Each dirham found in Sweden is physical evidence of an incredible journey, from a mine in Central Asia, passing through Baghdad's treasurers, reaching the hands of a merchant in Itil, capital of the Khazars, traded for furs with a Viking, carried upriver on the Volga, portaged through forests and swamps, and finally buried under a runic stone in some Scandinavian village. Each coin is an adventure frozen in time. But the exchanges weren't just of objects. Words traveled too. The Old Norse language absorbed Arabic and Persian terms, words for certain types of fabric, for spices, for commercial concepts. And the opposite also happened. Norse words entered the dialects of the trade routes. And there's more, techniques. The Vikings learned new navigation methods from the Arabs, who had centuries of experience in maritime voyages across the Indian Ocean. Instruments like the astrolabe eventually reached the north, revolutionizing Nordic navigation. In the opposite direction, the Arabs were fascinated by Viking shipbuilding. The Drakars were engineering marvels, light enough to be carried overland, but sturdy enough to cross rough seas. Some Arab scholars wrote treatises trying to understand how those northern navigators managed to build such efficient boats. It's interesting to note how peoples who considered themselves superior to each other could still recognize and admire each other's skills, isn't it? The commercial centers along the Volga route transformed into small cosmopolitan cities. Places like Itil, Bulgar, and later Novgorod became crossroads where merchants from all over the known world met. In a single day, you could see a Viking negotiating with a Persian merchant, while a Khazar Jew mediated the transaction and a Volga Bulgar watched waiting for his turn. These cities were noisy, chaotic, sometimes intense, but also vibrant and full of possibilities. It was where fortunes were made and lost, where cultures mixed, and new identities emerged. And here's something many people don't realize. These trade routes weren't just economically important. They were politically crucial. The silver that flowed from the south allowed the Vikings to finance their expeditions, both commercial and exploratory. This wealth helped establish the first organized Scandinavian kingdoms. Without Arab silver, the history of Scandinavia would be completely different. And in the south, The presence of the Ruses on the Volga route created an alternative channel for Asian trade, bypassing the Mediterranean, dominated by Byzantium. This gave the Abbasid Caliphate an important strategic advantage. It was a symbiosis. Two worlds that benefited mutually even without fully understanding each other. But like every story of encounter between cultures, there were also tensions, misunderstandings, and challenges to overcome. And it's about these complications that we're going to talk about next. Because real history is never just about harmonious cooperation, it's about real people trying to navigate profound differences while pursuing their goals. Between the sacred and the profane. When cultures collide, not everything was peaceful exchanges and shared prosperity. Behind the successful commercial transactions, there was an ocean of differences that sometimes exploded into tensions, sometimes transformed into curious misunderstandings, and frequently created situations of constant negotiation. Let's start with the most obvious: religion. For the 9th century Vikings, the world was populated by warrior gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, who demanded devotion and valued courage above all. Honor in life was the path to eternal glory. Rituals included complex ceremonies that Vikings considered normal and necessary to maintain connection with the divine. For the Muslims of the Abbasid Caliphate, there was one unique and absolute God, Allah, whose laws were clear and detailed in the Quran. Life was sacred, alcohol consumption was prohibited, there were strict rules about food and hygiene. The idea of polytheistic religious practices was not just strange, but fundamentally different from their understanding of the sacred. Imagine the shock when these two worldviews met face to face. Ibn Fadlan recorded his bewilderment when observing Viking customs. He was particularly impressed by the funeral ceremonies of the Rus, events that lasted days and involved the entire community in elaborate farewell rituals. For Ibn Fadlan, educated in Islamic values of funeral simplicity, this represented a completely different approach to the passage between worlds. But here's the interesting thing: the Vikings probably looked at some Islamic practices with equal curiosity. The prohibition of alcohol, for example, must have seemed incomprehensible to a people whose social culture revolved around feasts where they drank mead and beer. How to celebrate a victory without drinking, how to seal a deal without sharing a cup. And have you ever stopped to think what it would be like to try to do business with someone whose fundamental values are completely opposite to yours? How to find common ground when even the concept of right and wrong is different? Hygiene was another source of cultural fascination. Muslims had elaborate purification rituals before prayers. Specific washings, clean clothes, even the direction they faced had spiritual meaning. Ibn Fadlan was intrigued to see that the Rus, although they washed regularly, did so in a way different from what he was accustomed to. Several men using the same basin of water, a custom he found curious. For the Vikings, that was perfectly normal and practical. For Ibn Fadlan, it was just another demonstration of how everyday practices could vary dramatically between cultures, but here's the marvel of human nature. Despite all this, trade continued, because at the end of the day, both sides wanted something the other had. And this mutual need was stronger than cultural shock. The Vikings quickly learned to adapt their behavior when they were in Muslim territory. Some even adopted certain Islamic customs to facilitate business. It wasn't exactly out of deep conviction, but it was pragmatic. And pragmatism, we discover, is a universal language. On the Arab side, there was an interesting distinction. The merchants and travelers who actually interacted with the Rus tended to develop a more balanced view. Yes, they found the Vikings different and sometimes disconcerting, but they also recognized their commercial honesty, their courage, and their efficiency as business partners. The scholars and religious figures who had never left Baghdad or Damascus, however, maintained much more simplistic and stereotyped views. For them, the Vikings were just northern peoples, unworthy of serious attention. Funny how this reminds us a bit of our current world, isn't it? How people who actually interact with other cultures tend to have more complex views, while those who only know stereotypes maintain simple prejudices. And you, what do you think about this? Leave your opinion in the comments when you have a moment. There were also the practical complications of life in foreign territory. Language was a huge barrier. The first Vikings who arrived in Caliphate lands didn't speak a word of Arabic or Persian. Muslim merchants didn't speak Norse. How to negotiate prices, how to explain what you want to buy or sell. Here entered a fascinating class of intermediaries, professional translators. Many were Khazar Jews who, due to their geographical and cultural position, had learned multiple languages. Others were Vikings who had spent years on trade routes and mastered both Norse and Arabic. Some were multilingual people from various backgrounds valued precisely for their linguistic ability. These translators weren't just interpreters of words, they were cultural mediators, explaining not just what was said, but what was really meant. When a Viking offered a gift as part of the negotiation, the translator explained to the Arab merchant that this wasn't a bribe, but part of Norse protocol. When a Muslim refused to eat with the Vikings, the translator explained it wasn't a personal insult, but religious observance. Without these mediators, trade on the Volga route would have been impossible. But things weren't always resolved peacefully. There were, of course, conflicts. The Vikings weren't called warriors for nothing, and although most traveled as merchants, they were perfectly capable of defending their interests when necessary, or when they felt they had been treated unfairly. There are records of Viking military expeditions in areas of the Caspian Sea. In 913, a large Rus's fleet managed to pass through Khazar territory and conducted raids in coastal areas. Territories were disputed, resources were captured. It was a reminder that these trading partners were also formidable warriors when provoked. The response from local forces was proportional. When Vikings were captured after acts of aggression, the consequences were severe. This served as a deterrent to others who might think of trading commerce for confrontation. It was a delicate balance. Trade when possible, conflict when necessary. And both sides understood these unwritten rules. Within this context of occasional tension, there were also stories of surprising loyalty. Some Vikings who permanently settled in Muslim lands became so integrated that they defended their new homes against other invading Vikings. Imagine the complexity of that. Brothers by blood and culture facing each other because their loyalties had changed. And there were opposite cases, Arab merchants who lived so long among the Rus that they adopted Norse customs, learned their sagas, even participated in their festivals, all while maintaining, at least outwardly, their Islamic identity. These hybrid identities were the true fruit of the encounter between the desert and the forest. They were no longer purely Norse nor purely Arab. They were something new, forged on trade routes, in cosmopolitan markets, in the inevitable mixtures that happen when different people coexist long enough. And here's something fascinating. These hybrid identities became essential to the functioning of trade routes. They were the only ones who truly understood both worlds, who could navigate cultural complexities naturally, who knew when to follow the rules and when to adapt them. The medieval world, we discover, was much more fluid than we usually imagine. The boundaries between us and them were porous, and on the margins, in these intermediate spaces, new and unexpected things were born. But there was another important player in this intercultural drama, an empire that watched with growing interest the trade between Vikings and Arabs, Byzantium. And Constantinople's reaction to this new trade route would change everything in ways no one could predict. Because when three great powers, Vikings, Arabs, and Byzantines, start competing for the same space, the dynamics get really interesting. The third player, Byzantium, and the competition for the north. While Vikings and Arabs built their commercial bridges through the Volga route, there was an empire watching all this with growing interest. The Byzantine Empire, direct heir of Rome, guardian of Constantinople, the city that considered itself the center of the civilized world. Imagine Constantinople in the 10th century, a metropolis of 500,000 inhabitants, its triple walls considered impregnable, its cathedral of Hagia Sophia with its impossible dome defying gravity. The streets were paved with smooth stones, not the mud that covered most European cities. Roman aqueducts still functioned, bringing fresh water from the mountains. The smell of incense from churches mixed with the aromas of spices in the markets. It was a city that made Baghdad seem young and Viking capitals seem like villages. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true heirs of civilization. They preserved Greek knowledge, maintained Roman law, professed Orthodox Christianity, which they considered the only true faith, and they had a growing concern. The Volga route was diverting trade that traditionally passed through their territories. You see, for centuries, Constantinople had been the great entrepot between East and West. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Arab perfumes, everything eventually passed through its markets before continuing to Europe. And the Byzantines charged generous fees for this privilege, but now there was an alternative route. Vikings could bring northern products directly to the Islamic world without passing through Byzantine territory. And some of these Nordic products, especially furs, competed directly with goods that Byzantium traditionally supplied. This needed to be managed strategically. The Byzantine response was multifaceted and, like everything in Byzantium, deeply calculated. First, they tried to co-opt the Vikings. If they couldn't stop them, perhaps they could redirect them to more favorable routes. Constantinople began offering lucrative contracts for Viking warriors to serve in the Byzantine army. And not just any position, they formed the famous Varangian Guard, an elite unit that served as the emperor's personal protection. Think of the irony of this. Vikings who had sailed throughout Europe seeking opportunities now protected the throne of the world's most sophisticated empire. Warriors who worshipped Odin and Thor, guarding a Christian emperor in palaces covered with religious icons, but it worked. The Vikings proved to be loyal, efficient, and reliable, at least by Byzantine standards, where political intrigue was practically refined art. And in return, they received payments in gold that would make any Scandinavian leader consider the proposal attractive. Is there greater irony than former adversaries becoming allies through mutual interest? But the Byzantine strategy went beyond simply hiring Vikings. They also began promoting an alternative trade route, the path from the Varangians to the Greeks, as it became known. This route went from the Baltic, through the Dwina and Dnieper rivers, straight to the Black Sea and Constantinople. It was a more direct route for Vikings who wanted to reach Byzantium, completely bypassing the Abbasid Caliphate and the Volga route. And Constantinople made sure to make it attractive: tax incentives, protection along the way, guaranteed markets. The Vikings, pragmatic as always, took advantage of both routes. Some continued going to Baghdad through the Volga. Others preferred Constantinople through the Dnieper. And the most entrepreneurial made both journeys, maximizing opportunities. But this competition between routes created fascinating political dynamics. The Khazars, who controlled the Volga route and prospered enormously from it, saw their commercial dominance threatened. The Abbasid Caliphate realized that its access to Nordic products was becoming less exclusive, and Byzantium finally had a way to influence both Vikings and Arabs. It was medieval geopolitics in its most sophisticated expression. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. There was also the religious component, which in Byzantium could never be ignored. The Byzantines were devout Orthodox Christians and saw in the conversion of northern peoples both a spiritual calling and a smart political strategy. Byzantine missionaries began working among the Slavs and the Vikings themselves, who frequented Constantinople. The idea was simple: if you share faith with someone, you also bring them closer to your cultural and political sphere. And it worked, at least partially. Throughout the 10th century, many Russes began adopting Orthodox Christianity. Not all at once. There was considerable resistance from those who maintained the old Norse beliefs, but gradually, church by church, baptism by baptism, Byzantium was extending its influence northward. The decisive moment came in 988 when Vladimir I, Prince of Kiev, officially embraced Orthodox Christianity and promoted the conversion of his people. It was a transformative moment. The Kievan Rus, which had been a pagan and semi-nomadic entity, was becoming part of the Orthodox Christian world. And why did Vladimir choose Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium instead of Roman Catholicism or even Islam? Legends say he sent emissaries to observe different religions. The emissaries who went to Constantinople returned impressed by the beauty of the liturgy in Hagia Sophia. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," they reported. But the truth, of course, was more practical. Byzantium offered something Rome couldn't: an imperial princess as wife, privileged access to Byzantine markets, and recognition as a legitimate ruler on the international stage. It was faith, yes, but it was also strategic diplomacy. This conversion fundamentally changed the nature of relations between the Rus and the Islamic world. Christians and Muslims could trade, but there was now a religious distinction that didn't exist when the Vikings were pagans. Paradoxically, conversion to Christianity made the Rus closer to Byzantium, but created a new dynamic with the Caliphate. Alliances were shifting, identities were solidifying, and the trade routes that had been relatively fluid were beginning to become more defined by religious and political borders. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Varangian Guard continued serving Byzantine emperors with remarkable loyalty. They fought in campaigns in Syria, in Italy, in Bulgaria. They protected the palace against internal threats. They defended the emperor against challengers. And they became known, or feared, depending on who you asked, for their effectiveness in combat. There were stories of Varangians using their double axes, typically Norse weapons, with impressive skill in conflict situations. Their tactics were less elaborate than those of regular Byzantine units, but their determination was formidable, and they maintained connections with their homelands. Varangians who prospered in Byzantine service often returned to Scandinavia, bringing not just wealth, but also ideas, techniques, and stories of the most sophisticated empire they had ever seen. Some rune stones in Sweden and Norway still carry inscriptions of men who served in Miklagard, the Norse name for Constantinople, and returned to record their journeys. He traveled bravely, far in search of fortune. In the east, he prospered. He rested in the south in Serkland, Serkland being the region of Islamic influence. Each runestone is a monument to a life lived between worlds, to someone who saw both the forests of the north and the deserts of the south, who traded in Viking markets and served in Byzantine palaces. But the competition between Byzantium and the Caliphate for influence in the north wasn't just commercial and religious, it was also strategic. And when great empires compete, it's always the intermediate peoples who need to navigate carefully. The Khazars, the Volga Bulgars, the Russes themselves, all found themselves needing to balance between greater forces, having to make diplomatic choices or try to maintain advantageous neutrality. And these choices would shape the map of Eastern Europe for the next centuries. But before we get to these long-term consequences, we need to understand what life was really like in the cities that served as bridges between these worlds. The commercial centers where cultures didn't just meet, but mixed in unexpected and permanent ways. cities at the crossroads where the world met. To truly understand the encounter between the desert and the forest, we need to descend from the great narratives of empires and enter the bustling streets of the cities that made all this possible. Places that today are just names in history books, but that in the 10th century were vibrant crossroads where the entire world seemed to converge. Let's start with Itil, the capital of the Khazar Khaganate. Imagine a city built on the banks of the Volga River, where the river widens, forming a delta before flowing into the Caspian Sea. Itil was divided into two parts: the western city, where the common population lived and the markets were located, and the eastern city, where the Khagan, the king, resided in his palace. Between the two, the Volga flowed wide and calm, its waters reflecting the blue sky of the steppes. The air in Itil had a particular smell, a mixture of fresh fish from the river, spices brought from the south, leather tanned in workshops, and the constant dust that the wind brought from the surrounding steppes. It was a smell of commerce, of movement, of cultures meeting. In the streets of Itil, you could see a spectacle that few places in the world offered: a Jewish merchant negotiating in Hebrew with a Khazar client, a tall, blonde Viking discussing prices with a turbaned Persian, a Slav selling wild honey to a Muslim who observed his prayer times, a Nestorian Christian family sharing meals with neighbors of other traditions who had come from the eastern steppes. It was diversity on a level that would be remarkable even today. And the beauty of it? It worked. The Khazars had created a system of coexistence that was remarkable for its time. Each group could practice their traditions freely, as long as they contributed to the city and maintained commercial peace. It wasn't perfect. The Khazars obviously had political advantages, but it was much more open than most medieval places. Can you imagine that? A city where mosques, synagogues, churches, and spaces of different traditions coexisted just a few blocks from each other? But Itil wasn't just tolerant out of ideology. It was tolerant out of practical necessity. The city lived off trade, and trade requires that different peoples can meet, negotiate, trust each other. If you start creating conflicts over religious matters, soon you have no more merchants, and without merchants, you have no prosperous city. It was pragmatism that generated coexistence, and it worked wonderfully. Further north, at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, was the city of Bulgar, also known as Bulgar. This was the capital of the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had adopted Islam in the early 10th century. Bulgar had a unique characteristic. It was the northernmost point where Muslim merchants regularly traveled. Beyond there, the climate became too intense, the forests too dense, the customs too different. So Bulgar became the great transfer point between the Islamic world and the even more northern Nordic lands. The city had an impressive mosque, the northernmost in the Muslim world at the time, with a minaret that could be seen from kilometers away. It was a landmark of Islamic presence in the midst of steppes and forests, and around this mosque grew a multicultural city as diverse as Itil. Bulgar's market was especially famous. Here arrived the finest furs: black fox, sable marten, ermine, brought by the Vikings and by the native peoples of the northern forests. Here were traded products from Nordic expeditions, and here Muslim merchants offered silver, fabrics, Damascus steel weapons, and that most precious product of all, spices. There are reports that on market days you could hear more than 20 different languages being spoken in the streets of Bulgar. Imagine the cacophony, but also the vibrant energy. It was a place where fortunes were made in an afternoon and transformed the next morning, where a clever Viking could trade some furs for enough silver to return home as a prosperous man. where an Arab merchant could find products so rare that selling them in Baghdad would guarantee prosperity for years. And the food. Ah, the food in these cosmopolitan cities must have been an adventure in itself. Vikings accustomed to salted meat and dried fish, trying Persian pilaf and Arab bread. Muslim merchants tasting with curiosity Slavic stews. Khazars serving dishes that mixed influences from all directions. Could it be that the first culinary fusion in history happened in these cities of the Volga route? Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. Further north still, where the Volkhov River meets Lake Ilmen, a city was growing that would one day become one of the most important in Europe, Novgorod. In the 10th century, Novgorod was still relatively small, but its position was strategic. It was on the route between the Baltic and the river system that led to both the Volga and the Dnieper. Whoever controlled Novgorod controlled access to and from Scandinavia. And Novgorod had a unique characteristic. It was governed by an assembly system, the Vech, where free men voted on important decisions. It wasn't exactly democracy in the modern sense, but it was much more participatory than the feudal systems that dominated most of Europe. This more open political structure made Novgorod an attractive place for merchants. There was more stability, less dependence on the whim of a single ruler, and merchants value stability above almost everything. In the streets of Novgorod, wooden constructions crowded along the river. The smell of fresh pine mixed with tar, used to waterproof boats, filled the air. In winter, and the winters were long and harsh, the city was covered in snow, the streets turned to ice, and life moved indoors, around fireplaces where stories were told, and business was planned for spring. But even in winter, trade didn't stop completely. Sleds replaced boats. Furs were even more valuable when you were surrounded by penetrating cold, and merchants who had survived the summer voyages now gathered in heated taverns to drink, socialize, tell stories about their adventures, and occasionally plan the next expedition. These cities, Itil, Bulgar, Novgorod, and dozens of smaller ones, were the nodes of a commercial network that connected worlds. And the people who lived in them developed a unique mentality. They were no longer purely Khazar or Viking or Arab. They were inhabitants of trade routes, citizens of a mercantile civilization that transcended ethnic and religious borders. Their children grew up speaking multiple languages. Their marriages mixed cultures. Their homes had objects from all corners of the known world: a Persian carpet on the floor, a Norse axe on the wall, an Arab oil lamp on the table, coins from 5 different empires kept as reserve for hard times. And here's something fascinating. These hybrid identities, these people who lived between worlds, were often viewed with curiosity by both traditional Nordics and established Arabs. They were considered different, not completely from one place nor another, but they were essential. Without them, without this class of cultural intermediaries who understood multiple worlds, the trade routes wouldn't have functioned so well. They were the gears that made the machine run smoothly. Something to reflect on, isn't it? How people who live on the frontiers, in the intermediate spaces, are often the most important, even when they're the least celebrated. In these cities were also born the first attempts at intercultural legal systems. How do you judge a dispute between a pagan Viking and a Muslim merchant? What law applies? Whose court has jurisdiction? The solution, pragmatic as always, was to create mixed tribunals. Judges from different backgrounds heard cases together. The laws were a mixture of traditions, a bit of Islamic practice here, a bit of Norse custom there, a bit of Khazar precedent over there. It wasn't elegant from a legal standpoint, but it worked in practice. It was the kind of legal experimentation that centuries later would influence the development of commercial systems throughout Europe. But at the time, it was simply the only way to maintain order in cities where 5 different cultures coexisted on the same streets. And they truly coexisted. There is archaeological evidence of mixed neighborhoods where houses of different ethnic and religious groups stood side by side. Of course, there were also concentrations, areas where a specific group predominated, but the general rule was mixture, not rigid segregation. The children of these cities grew up seeing as normal what their grandparents would have considered extraordinary. A Viking boy in Bulgar grew up hearing the call to prayer 5 times a day and found it as natural as the wind. A Khazar girl in Itil grew up seeing giant Vikings walking the streets and didn't think anything of it. A young Arab in Novgorod got used to the penetrating cold and learned winter survival techniques, something his relatives in Baghdad would consider unimaginable. That's how cultures really mixed. Not through grand declarations or official policies, but through generations growing up together, normalizing what was once strange, transforming them into us. But these cosmopolitan cities, as fascinating as they were also fragile. They depended on a delicate balance of political and economic forces. And when that balance began to unravel, and it would begin to unravel soon, the world they had built would enter transformation. But before we get to that point, we need to understand a crucial aspect we haven't fully explored yet. What exactly were Vikings and Arabs learning from each other beyond commercial techniques? Beyond trade. Ideas that traveled thousands of kilometers. When we think of medieval trade, we usually imagine physical goods, furs, silver, spices, silk. But what really traveled along trade routes was much deeper and more lasting: knowledge, techniques, ideas. And it was in these intangible exchanges that the encounter between Vikings and Arabs left its most permanent legacy. Let's start with something surprisingly practical: navigation. The Vikings were masters of northern seas, cold, temperamental, unpredictable waters. They navigated using a combination of intimate knowledge of currents, observation of stars, and even natural signs that indicated proximity to land. It was intuitive navigation based on generations of accumulated experience, but it wasn't precise in the sense that Arabs understood precision. Muslim navigators, heirs to Phoenician, Greek, and Indian traditions, had developed something revolutionary: mathematics applied to navigation. They used the astrolabe, an instrument that allowed measuring the height of stars above the horizon, thus calculating latitude with reasonable precision. They had detailed astronomical tables. They knew spherical geometry. For a Viking accustomed to navigating by feeling the sea, seeing an Arab merchant calculating his position with numbers and instruments must have been like watching magic. And some Vikings, the most curious and ambitious, learned. Not completely. Arab mathematics required years of study that warrior merchants rarely had, but enough to understand the basic principles. And these principles, taken back to Scandinavia, slowly began to transform Nordic navigation. Centuries later, when Vikings, now already called Normans, would establish presence in the Mediterranean, they would use navigation techniques that were a fusion of Nordic traditions and Islamic knowledge. Without ever fully realizing they were navigating with wisdom inherited from those encounters on the banks of the Volga. It's fascinating to think about it, isn't it? How knowledge can travel through generations, transforming itself, adapting, until no one remembers its origin anymore. In the opposite direction, Arabs were impressed by Viking shipbuilding. The dracars were marvels of adaptive engineering. They could sail in deep ocean waters, but also in shallow rivers. They were light enough to be carried overland in portages, but sturdy enough to survive storms in the North Sea. How did they achieve this? The answer was in the construction technique: overlapping planks that created flexible hulls, capable of absorbing the impact of waves instead of resisting rigidly, elevated prows and sterns that cut through waves, shallow keels that allowed navigation in superficial waters. Arab scholars who saw these boats tried to incorporate some of these principles into Islamic designs. Not directly. Arab boats had different requirements for different seas, but the idea of structural flexibility, of adaptability to multiple environments, that idea traveled, and with it traveled something more: mutual respect. Arabs who initially saw Vikings only as northern peoples began to recognize that these navigators were extremely intelligent and innovative in their own traditions. Metallurgy was another area of fascinating exchange. Vikings produced excellent swords using layered forging techniques, folding steel repeatedly to create strong and flexible blades. But Damascus steel produced in the Islamic world, originally in India and Persia, was of a quality that surpassed even the best Nordic swords. The secret was in the metal composition and the forging process that created characteristic patterns on the blade, those wavy lines that look like flowing water. Vikings who managed to acquire Damascus steel swords treated them as treasures, passing them from generation to generation, giving them names as if they were living beings. And some Viking blacksmiths tried to replicate the technique. They didn't succeed completely. True Damascus steel remained a mystery until the modern era, but in the process they developed their own variations, creating swords that were hybrids of Nordic techniques and Islamic inspiration. Each of these swords was a small work of intercultural art, a piece of metal that contained knowledge from two worlds. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. But perhaps the deepest exchanges were conceptual, ideas about how to organize societies, about law, about the role of the individual versus the collective. Vikings came from a tradition of assemblies, the thing, where free men gathered to make decisions and resolve disputes. It was community participation, limited but real. The concept of law as something discussed by the community, not simply imposed from above, was fundamental to the Nordic mentality. Arabs, on the other hand, came from a tradition where law was divine, Sharia, derived from the Quran and Hadiths. The idea was that law wasn't human creation, but divine revelation. The role of rulers and scholars was to interpret and apply this law, not create it. When these two systems met, it created fascinating intellectual tension. How do you negotiate when your own conceptions of justice are fundamentally different? The solution, pragmatically developed in commercial cities, was what we could call practical legal pluralism. Disputes between members of the same group were resolved according to their own laws. Disputes between members of different groups were resolved by mixed tribunals using principles everyone could accept, generally focused on material compensation and restoration of commercial peace. It wasn't philosophically elegant, but it worked in practice. And in the process, both sides learned that law could be more flexible, more adaptable than their traditions suggested. Some Vikings who spent years in Islamic lands returned home with new ideas, concepts about organized charity, inspired by Islamic zakat, about public hospitals, an Islamic innovation, about libraries and preservation of knowledge. Most of these ideas didn't find immediate fertile ground in 10th century Scandinavia, but seeds were planted. And some Arabs who interacted with the Rus returned with their own interesting ideas. Notions about popular assemblies, about dialogue in governance decisions, about the idea that systems could be questioned and adapted. These ideas were challenging to established power structures. Most were absorbed slowly or adapted. But some survived, circulating in conversations, influencing thinkers, waiting for historical moments when they could flourish. Language also traveled. Arabic words entered Old Norse and Slavic languages. Terms for fabrics, atlas, cotton, spices, saffron, mathematical concepts, algorithm, zero, although these specific ones came later through other routes. Norse words entered the dialects of trade routes, nautical terms, words for types of furs, concepts about ice and cold that didn't exist in southern languages, and with words, traveled concepts. When you adopt a word from another language, you often also adopt the idea behind it, the way of seeing the world that this word encapsulates. There were also exchanges in the medical sphere. Arabs had a sophisticated medical tradition, inherited from the Greeks and expanded by Islamic scholars. Hospitals, complex procedures, systematic use of herbal medicines, all this was advanced by the standards of the time. Vikings, on the other hand, had a more practical and empirical medicine. They knew herbs that worked for certain conditions, even without fully understanding why, had treatment techniques developed through centuries of experience, knew how to perform necessary procedures when situations demanded. When these two traditions met, there was initially mutual skepticism. Arab physicians found Viking methods primitive. Viking healers found Arab physicians excessively theoretical. But slowly, through practical observation, both sides began to learn. Arab physicians in commercial cities adopted certain Nordic techniques for treating cold-related conditions, something their medical texts had never considered. Viking healers learned about southern medicinal herbs and spices that were more effective than their local alternatives. It was intercultural medicine being born not from academies or schools, but from practical necessity in markets and trade routes. And there were, of course, more subtle cultural exchanges. Stories traveled. An Arab merchant who spent months traveling with Vikings heard their sagas, stories of Odin seeking wisdom, of Thor facing giants, of Ragnarok, the end of the world. And these stories, retold later in Baghdad taverns, entered the Islamic imagination as exotic legends from the frozen north. In the opposite direction, Vikings heard stories from the Quran, Persian legends, tales from the 1001 Nights that were being compiled at that time. And these stories, taken back to Nordic halls, mixed with local sagas, creating hybrid versions that were neither purely Norse nor purely Islamic. Can you imagine a skald, Viking poet, in a hall in Norway, reciting a saga that unconsciously incorporated elements of Arab stories heard years before on the banks of the Volga? The audience would never know, but the story would be richer for it. That's the magic of genuine cultural encounter. It's not just about preserving separate traditions side by side, it's about creating something new, something that could only exist because two worlds touched. There were also changes in music. Instruments traveled along with goods. Vikings brought back string instruments they had seen in the south, not exactly the same as Arab ones, but inspired by them. And they tried to adapt melodies they had heard, incorporating them into their own musical repertoire. The result was fascinating fusion, melodies that had elements of traditional Norse chanting, but also scales and rhythms that seemed distant echoes of Islamic music. No contemporary would have described it as world music, but that's exactly what it was. World music born from encounters on trade routes. Imagine a night in Novgorod. Inside a heated hall while snow falls outside, a musician plays a melody on a stringed instrument. The melody is strange but familiar, carrying something from the north, but also something from the south. People listen, drink mead, maybe even dance. None of them knows they're participating in cultural fusion that historians, centuries later, will find fascinating. That's how cultures really mixed, not through manifestos or official policies, but through small, personal, almost invisible moments of shared creativity. In architecture, there were also subtle exchanges. Vikings who had seen the impressive structures of Baghdad or even the mosques of Bulgar returned with new ideas about what was possible to build. Of course, northern wood and stone didn't allow domes like those in the south, but concepts about scale, about decoration, about use of interior space, these ideas could be adapted. Some of the oldest Orthodox churches built by the Rus show architectural influences that clearly didn't come only from Byzantium. There are elements, small decorative details, certain geometric patterns, that seem like echoes of Islamic architecture filtered through multiple adaptations. No conscious architect was trying to create Norse Islamic synthesis. But synthesis happened anyway, because ideas in builders' heads are formed by everything they've seen, everything they've absorbed throughout their lives and careers. And perhaps the deepest change was conceptual, the very idea that the world was larger, more diverse, more complex than local imagination allowed. Before intense contact with the Islamic world, Vikings had a relatively geographically limited worldview. There was Scandinavia, the lands they could reach by sea or river, and beyond that, legends, myths, places perhaps real, perhaps imaginary. After generations of trade on the Volga route, this vision expanded dramatically. Vikings, now Rusi, knew that far beyond their lands there were vast empires, cities of 1 million inhabitants, knowledge accumulated in enormous libraries. The world was provably larger and more marvelous than their ancient legends suggested. This changes how you think about your own place in the world. When you know other great civilizations exist, you can no longer naively assume your own culture is the center of everything. You're forced to see yourself in broader context. For some, this was disconcerting. They would have preferred the old simplicity. For others, it was liberating. The world was full of possibilities they had never imagined. And this expansion of consciousness, this openness to the vastness of the world, became a permanent part of the identity that would eventually become Russian. Russia has always seen itself as between worlds, as a bridge between East and West. And this self-perception has direct roots in those encounters between Vikings and Arabs centuries ago on the Volga. But not all exchanges were peaceful or mutually enriching. There was also what we could call competitive learning, each side studying the other to find strategic and commercial advantages. And this type of learning, more pragmatic but equally important, also shaped the relationship between the desert and the forest in ways we'll explore next. Strategy, competition, and the realities of medieval trade. Not everything that traveled along trade routes was beneficial or uplifting. Along with goods and ideas, there also circulated strategic information, commercial secrets, and a primitive but effective form of competitive intelligence. Because when empires compete, even merchants become observers in a much larger game. Let's start with something that rarely appears in history books: Vikings as strategic observers. Think about it. A Viking merchant who regularly traveled to Baghdad or other Caliphate cities wasn't just selling furs, he was observing. How were city defenses organized? Which river routes were less monitored? Where were the storage centers and resources? This information wasn't collected systematically. Vikings didn't have formal intelligence agencies, but it was shared naturally. Back in Novgorod or Kiev, in meetings of leaders and princes, these casual observations transformed into valuable strategic knowledge. And it worked both ways. Arab merchants who traveled north paid attention to important details. How many warriors could the Ruses mobilize? How well equipped were they? What were their negotiation tactics? Where were their commercial vulnerabilities? Trade, we discover, has always been inseparable from strategic observation. There was also what we could call competitive technical learning. When a Viking saw an astrolabe for the first time, he didn't just admire the object, he tried to understand how it worked, maybe even acquire one to take back. When an Arab blacksmith saw an exceptionally high-quality Viking sword, he studied the construction, tried to discover the forging principles. It wasn't appropriation in the modern sense of intellectual property. The concept didn't even exist. It was simply how knowledge spread in a world without patents or copyrights. If you could observe something, you could try to learn it, and if you were skillful enough, maybe even improve it. But there were limits. Certain secrets were carefully guarded. The exact location of certain silver mines, the route to hidden treasures, the political alliances a ruler was discreetly negotiating, specific production methods that gave competitive advantage. And revealing these secrets, intentionally or not, could have serious consequences. There are records of merchants facing problems on both sides, Vikings and Arabs, for breaking commercial or political trust. The line between merchant and traitor was sometimes very thin. Does this sound familiar? The way today international business always carries a component of competitive intelligence, of protecting sensitive information. The Khazars, strategically positioned in the middle of all this, became masters at this information game. They charged not just fees for transit of goods, but also benefited from the flow of information. Want to know what the Vikings are planning? Talk to a well-connected Khazar merchant. Want to know political conditions in Baghdad? The same merchant probably has valuable insights. It was a profitable business, but also delicate. The Khazars had to maintain careful balance. If they were seen as too close to one side, they lost trust from the other. And trust on medieval trade routes was worth more than gold. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. There were also direct strategic adaptations resulting from these encounters. Vikings, after observing cavalry tactics used by Muslim and Khazar forces, began experimenting with their own cavalry. Traditionally infantry fighters and naval combatants, some Rus' groups began incorporating elements of mounted combat into their strategies. It wasn't easy. Vikings were raised on boats and in shield formations. Horses required completely different training, different resources, different tactics. But those who managed to master this fusion of styles became more versatile. Centuries later, when the descendants of the Ruses, the medieval principalities of the region, developed their own military traditions, there were in them elements both Nordic and from the steppes, a direct heritage of these first contacts on the Volga routes. On the Islamic side, there was interest in Viking infantry tactics. The shield formation, where warriors lined up shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, creating an almost impenetrable defense, was something that impressed Arab observers. Some Islamic military units began training similar formations, especially for situations where cavalry was less effective. It was a pragmatic adaptation, incorporate what worked, regardless of origin. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of these exchanges was the trade in people. And here we need to talk honestly about a difficult reality of the time. Vikings were prolific captors during their expeditions. Their travels throughout Eastern Europe resulted in the capture of Slavs. And that's where the word slave comes from in many European languages, a sad derivation of Slav. These captured people were then traded on the routes, many ending up in distant markets. The Abbasid Caliphate, like most medieval societies, accepted the institution of slavery. Enslaved people worked in homes, in fields, in workshops. Some, paradoxically, achieved positions of responsibility, especially the Mamluks, who would eventually form their own dynasties. But for those captured in the northern forests and taken south in adverse conditions, this was a journey of separation and suffering. Removed from their families, unable to speak the language of their captors, treated as merchandise in the same markets where spices and silk were traded. It's important to recognize this reality without romanticization. The encounter between desert and forest wasn't just fascinating exchanges of knowledge, it was also exploitation, separation of families, lives transformed into commodities in the name of profit. How do we balance admiration for the cultural achievements of these civilizations with recognition of their problematic practices? It's a question that has no easy answer. The trade in people also created political tensions. Slavic communities that suffered from Viking incursions obviously resented it. Some formed alliances for resistance, others tried to become intermediaries in the trade, participating in the system to avoid being targets themselves. It was a cycle that fueled conflicts throughout Eastern Europe. and the resources that flowed from the Caliphate financed these capture expeditions, creating an economic system based on human suffering. Over time, as the Ruses settled and Christianized, the trade in people changed. The Orthodox Church discouraged the enslavement of Christians by other Christians, at least in theory. In practice, there were exceptions and adaptations, but moral pressure began to reduce the scale of trafficking. But this took centuries. During the golden age of the Volga routes, the trade in people was a constant and lucrative reality we cannot ignore when telling this story. There was also more direct economic competition. Viking and Arab merchants weren't just trading partners, they were also competitors. Both wanted to maximize gains, and that sometimes meant maneuvers we would recognize today as aggressive business practices. Temporary monopolies were created. Groups of merchants organized to control the supply of certain products, influencing prices. Alternative routes were sometimes blocked or hindered. Discrete agreements redistributed commercial territories. And when economic competition intensified too much, there was always the possibility of conflict. Caravans were attacked, sometimes by independent groups, sometimes by disguised competitors. Warehouses burned in suspicious accidents. Rival merchants disappeared mysteriously. It was capitalism in its rawest form, without regulations or international laws to moderate excesses. Governments, whether Viking leaders, Khazar Khagans, or Abbasid Caliphs, tried to maintain order, but their control was limited. Trade routes were long, territory vast, oversight impossible to be complete. In practice, much depended on unwritten codes of mercantile honor and the threat of retaliation. If you betrayed a trading partner, news would spread quickly. Your reputation would be tarnished. No one would trade with you with confidence anymore. In an economy based on long-term relationships, this was practically commercial death sentence. So there was a delicate balance, intense competition, but within certain unwritten limits. And this balance, maintained by self-interest more than by law or morality, allowed trade to continue even amid all the tensions. But this balance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Larger forces were in motion, political, religious, even climatic changes that would begin to fundamentally transform the world of the Volga routes. And when transformation came, it would be faster than many expected, catching even the most attentive observers by surprise. When balance unravels, the beginning of transformation. Around the year 965, something fundamental changed in the delicate balance that kept the Volga routes functioning. Unlike so many important historical changes, it began with a strategic decision that seemed at the time just another political move among many. Sviatoslav I, Prince of Kiev, decided to expand his influence over the Khazar Khaganate. Imagine the scene. Rus's forces descending the Volga, not as merchants, but as an army on a mission of conquest. Sviatoslav was different from previous Rus's leaders, more ambitious, more strategic, less interested in peaceful trade, and more interested in territorial dominance. He had grown up hearing stories of the riches that flowed through Khazar territory, observing the taxes his people paid to use the trade routes, and he decided he'd rather control these routes than pay for them. The campaign was intense and effective. Itil, that cosmopolitan city we described chapters ago, was conquered. Its structures were transformed, its administrative systems reorganized. The diversity that had made Itil such a unique place faced days of radical change. Religious centers of different traditions were affected. The Khazar Khaganate never fully recovered. Although it survived in reduced form for a few more decades, its power was broken. And with it, so was the system of mediation and protection that had made peaceful trade between North and South possible. It's thoughtful to imagine this, isn't it? How centuries of cultural construction can be transformed in weeks of conflict. But the political reconfiguration of the Khazars was just a symptom of larger changes. The world was transforming in ways that would make the old trade routes increasingly less viable as they were. First change, religious. The conversion of the Rus to Orthodox Christianity in 988, which we mentioned before, wasn't just a spiritual matter, it was a fundamental geopolitical reorientation. Kiev now looked to Constantinople, not Baghdad, as its main partner and model of civilization. Trade routes followed this new orientation. Instead of descending the Volga to the Caspian and the Islamic world, more and more merchants preferred to descend the Dnieper to the Black Sea and Byzantium. It was shorter, considered safer after the political changes, and aligned with Kiev's new relationships. The Volga didn't dry up completely, trade continued, but it never again had the same centrality or volume. It was as if a major artery of world trade had been partially redirected. Second change, climatic. The period between the 8th and 11th centuries is called by scientists the medieval warm period. Temperatures in Europe and Asia were slightly higher than in previous centuries. This had facilitated Nordic navigation, allowed agricultural expansion, made long-distance travel more viable. But around the 11th century, the climate began to cool again. Winters became more severe. Rivers froze for longer periods. The time window during which commercial voyages were possible shortened year after year. For the Vikings, accustomed to cold, this was manageable but challenging. For Arab merchants, accustomed to the heat of the Caliphate, it became increasingly less attractive to travel to the frozen north when there were more temperate alternative routes. Have you ever stopped to think how seemingly small climate changes can have significant historical consequences? How a few degrees of difference in average temperature can redirect the flow of trade? Third change, political in the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad was losing its former shine. The Islamic Golden Age was coming to an end not abruptly but through a gradual process. The Caliphate fragmented into semi-independent emirates. Internal conflicts drained resources. Movements from the east created instability. And when Baghdad was in transition, there was less demand for exotic products from the north. Less silver flowed to finance trade. Arab merchants had more urgent concerns than traveling thousands of kilometers to acquire furs. It was a convergence of factors making the old system less viable. But there was also a fourth change, perhaps the deepest, generational. The people who had built the Volga routes, that first generation of adventurous Vikings and curious Arab merchants, were aging or had already departed. Their children had grown up in a world where these routes already existed, were already established. And their grandchildren? Their grandchildren had become more sedentary. The Russes were no longer semi-nomadic Vikings living off trade and expeditions. They were Orthodox Slavic princes governing agricultural territories. They built stone churches, didn't sail in dracars with the same frequency. Their horizons had altered, become more local. On the Arab side, merchants from Baghdad, who 3 generations earlier would have considered a trip to the Volga a lucrative adventure, now saw it as unnecessary and risky. Why risk months of travel when there was sufficient trade closer to home? The adventurous ambition that had created the routes was diminishing, replaced by caution and preference for the familiar. It's a dynamic we see repeated throughout history, isn't it? How first generations build through boldness, second generations maintain through diligence, and third generations often let structures transform through inertia. The cities that had been cosmopolitan crossroads began to change character. Bulgar continued to exist, but increasingly as a regional Islamic city, less as an intense intercultural meeting point. Novgorod grew in importance, but its orientation changed. Now it looked west, to the Baltic, and the commercial networks emerging there, not south, to the Volga. Itil, that marvel of coexistence, was never rebuilt to its former glory. The site was eventually abandoned, left to the sands and oblivion. Today, archaeologists still debate its exact location, searching through evidence for traces of that extraordinary city. It's melancholic to imagine the last caravans descending the Volga, the last merchants who remembered how things were at their peak. They must have noticed the changes: fewer boats on the rivers, emptier markets, less frequented routes. They must have wondered what had happened, why the world they knew was transforming, but they probably didn't fully understand the bigger picture. No one at the time could have seen how multiple forces were converging to reshape an era. Does this make us think about our own time? How massive changes often happen gradually, without us fully noticing until a phase has already passed. Around the year 1100, the Volga routes still technically existed, but they were a shadow of what they had been. Trade volume had fallen dramatically. Encounters between Russes and Arabs were rare and less significant. The complex system of cultural intermediaries, those fascinating people who lived between worlds, was dissolving. The next generation would have no personal memory of the Golden Age. For them, stories about cosmopolitan cities on the Volga, where 5 religious traditions coexisted peacefully, would seem like exaggerated tales of elders. The idea that Vikings and Arabs had been close trading partners would be hard to believe. History was transforming into legend. And legends, we know, are often simplified, eventually partially forgotten. But not everything was lost. Because even when the physical routes lost their centrality, even when cities were abandoned and markets dispersed, something remained. The connections forged, the knowledge exchanged, the hybrid identities created, all this left permanent marks. The region that emerged from the Rus's principalities was fundamentally different from what it would have been without these centuries of contact with the Islamic world. Its position between East and West, its complex identity, its openness to multiple influences. Everything had roots in those encounters along the Volga. And in the Islamic world, especially in regions that had been closest to the northern routes, there were memories preserved in texts, objects, borrowed words. Ibn Fadlan and other chroniclers had recorded their encounters with the Rus, and these texts survived, waiting centuries until modern scholars would rediscover them and recognize their value. So although the routes lost their centrality, their heritage lived. And this heritage, in subtle and not always obvious ways, would continue to shape the history of Eurasia for the following centuries, leaving a legacy we can still trace today. Invisible legacies: how the encounter shaped cultures. Sometimes the deepest changes are those we can't see directly. They're not signed treaties or conquered territories, but subtle transformations in how people think, create, imagine their place in the world. And it was at this invisible level that the encounter between Vikings and Arabs left its most lasting marks. Let's start with something seemingly simple: ornamentation. If you look at Viking artifacts from the 8th century, before intense contact with the Islamic world, you'll see mainly geometric and zoomorphic patterns, complex interlacings of lines, stylized animals, twisted dragons and serpents. It was powerful art, but relatively limited in its visual vocabulary. Now look at artifacts from the 10th century, after generations of contact with Arab merchants. Something changed. Patterns became more intricate, more delicate. Floral motifs appear that had never been in traditional Norse art. The very technique of working precious metals became more refined. It wasn't direct copying. Vikings weren't simply imitating Islamic art. It was something more subtle: absorption of aesthetic sensibilities, unconscious incorporation of design principles, creative fusion that resulted in something unique, neither purely Norse nor Islamic. Imagine a Viking goldsmith in Novgorod working silver to create a bracelet. He's never been to Baghdad, but his master learned techniques from someone who learned from an Arab merchant decades ago. The goldsmith's hands move in patterns his ancestors didn't know, creating beauty that incorporates two worlds without realizing it. Curious how art can travel that way, isn't it? How techniques and sensibilities can pass from hand to hand through generations until no one remembers their origin anymore. In literature, there were also transformations. The Norse sagas, those great epic narratives about heroes and gods, began incorporating elements that seemed to come from different narrative traditions. More complex story structures with multiple layers of meaning, more elaborate descriptions of distant places, a broader sense of world geography. Of course, the sagas were fundamentally Norse, but they had been enriched by contact with the Islamic narrative tradition, which at the time was perhaps the most sophisticated in the world. Viking merchants who spent winters in Volga listening to Arab storytellers returned home with new ways of structuring narratives, new rhythms of telling stories. And these influences infiltrated the sagas that were told during long Scandinavian winters when families gathered around the fire and stories were the main form of entertainment and transmission of values. On the Islamic side, there were parallel transformations. Arabic literature about the northern world grew considerably. Traveler accounts like Ibn Fadlan's became popular, feeding the imagination of readers who would never leave their cities, but were fascinated by descriptions of lands where the sun barely set in summer and barely rose in winter. These descriptions of the North began appearing in literary works, poetry, tales, even discussions about the diversity of creation. The Nordic world, previously simply unknown or ignored, entered Islamic cultural consciousness as a real place, inhabited by real people, though different, not just mythical creatures. It was expansion of mental horizon. And expanded mental horizons change everything. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. There were also changes in music. Instruments traveled along with goods. Vikings brought back string instruments they had seen in the south. Not exactly the same as Arab ones, but inspired by them. And they tried to adapt melodies they had heard, incorporating them into their own musical repertoire. The result was fascinating fusion. Melodies that had elements of traditional Norse chanting, but also scales and rhythms that seemed distant echoes of Islamic music. No contemporary would have described it as world music, but that's exactly what it was. World music born from encounters on trade routes. Imagine a night in Novgorod. Inside a heated hall, while snow falls outside, a musician plays a melody on a stringed instrument. The melody is strange but familiar, carrying something from the north, but also something from the south. People listen, drink mead, maybe that even dance. None of them knows they're participating in cultural fusion that scholars centuries later will find fascinating. That's how cultures really mixed, not through manifestos or official policies, but through small, personal, almost invisible moments of shared creativity. In architecture, there were also subtle exchanges. Vikings who had seen the impressive structures of Baghdad or even the mosques of Bulgar returned with new ideas about what was possible to build. Of course, northern wood and stone didn't allow domes like those in the south, but concepts about scale, about decoration, about use of interior space, these ideas could be adapted. Some of the oldest Orthodox churches built by the Rus show architectural influences that clearly didn't come only from Byzantium. There are elements, small decorative details, certain geometric patterns, that seem like echoes of Islamic architecture filtered through multiple adaptations. No conscious architect was trying to create Norse-Islamic synthesis, but synthesis happened anyway because ideas in builders' heads are formed by everything they've seen, everything they've absorbed throughout their lives and careers. There were also changes in concepts of hygiene and personal care. Vikings were, contrary to popular stereotype, relatively clean by medieval standards, But contact with Islamic hygiene practices, which were exceptionally advanced, raised standards even further. Bathhouses became more common in Rus's cities. Soaps and perfumed oils imported from the south became status symbols. The very idea of cleanliness as related to spirituality, a central concept in Islam, found echo in the Orthodox Christianity the Rus adopted. It's interesting to note how even intimate and everyday practices like hygiene can be influenced by cultural encounters, isn't it? Concepts of hospitality were also transformed. Norse tradition already valued hosting travelers. It was an obligation in a land where being caught in the cold could mean danger. But the Islamic concept of hospitality was even more elaborate, almost ritualistic. There were specific rules about how to receive guests, how long they should stay, what foods to offer. Vikings who spent time in Islamic territory observed these practices. Some incorporated elements when returning home. The way guests were received in Rus's homes began showing influences, kept more formality, more ritual, greater emphasis on generosity as a defining virtue. And hospitality is not a small thing. It's foundational to how societies function, how strangers become acquaintances, how trust is built across cultural borders. There were even culinary changes that were lasting. Spices that Vikings had discovered through trade with the south eventually established themselves in northern cuisine. Not in large quantities, spices were expensive, but enough to change flavors, to introduce palates to new possibilities. Food preservation techniques also traveled. Drying and salting methods that were common in the Islamic world were adapted for Nordic products. And in the opposite direction, Norse techniques of cold preservation and smoking interested southern peoples who sometimes needed to preserve food in colder, mountainous regions. It was practical, everyday exchange that improved the lives of common people in ways they probably didn't always recognize as coming from cultural interchange. But perhaps the deepest change was conceptual, the very idea that the world was larger, more diverse, more complex than local imagination allowed. Before intense contact with the Islamic world, Vikings had a relatively geographically limited worldview. There was Scandinavia, the lands they could reach by sea or river, and beyond that, legends, myths, places perhaps real, perhaps imaginary. After generations of trade on the Volga route, this vision expanded dramatically. Vikings, now Rusi, knew that far beyond their lands there were vast empires, cities of 1 million inhabitants, knowledge accumulated in enormous libraries. The world was provably larger and more marvelous than their ancient legends suggested. This changes how you think about your own place in the world. When you know other great civilizations exist, you can no longer naively assume your own culture is the center of everything. You're forced to see yourself in broader context. For some, this was disconcerting. They would have preferred the old certainty. For others, it was liberating. The world was full of possibilities they had never imagined. And this expansion of consciousness, this openness to the vastness of the world, became a permanent part of the identity that would develop in the region. The position between East and West, this characteristic of being a bridge between worlds, has direct roots in those encounters between Vikings and Arabs centuries ago. On the Islamic side, the impact was perhaps less dramatic. After all, the Islamic world was already vast and cosmopolitan. But even so, there were changes. The awareness that a complex and capable Nordic world existed, not just northern peoples to be ignored, expanded the Islamic intellectual horizon. And some of the Islamic regions that had been closest to the northern routes, especially areas of the Volga Bulgars and other Turkic peoples who had adopted Islam, developed unique hybrid identities, being both part of the Islamic world while maintaining connections and memories of the world of the steppes and northern forests. These hybrid identities survived. Today, peoples like the Tatars are direct heirs of these cultural mixtures that happened on medieval trade routes. their language, their culture, their very existence is testimony that when worlds truly meet, the result is not the domination of one over the other, but creation of something new. And that's hopeful, isn't it? In a world that often seems divided into incompatible blocks, the history of the Volga routes reminds us that borders are porous, cultures are adaptable, and genuine encounters, even between very different peoples, can create unexpected richness. But to complete our journey, we need to look one last time at how this historical chapter was rediscovered and what it teaches us today. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about how the past informs our present and helps us imagine our future. Rediscovery. When archaeologists found lost worlds. For centuries, the stories about the encounter between Vikings and Arabs remained forgotten. Not completely lost, some texts survived in libraries, manuscripts kept waiting for someone to recognize their importance, but forgotten in the sense that they were no longer part of historical consciousness, neither for the descendants of the Vikings nor of the Arabs. It was as if this entire chapter of human history had been erased from collective memory. And then, in the 19th century, something changed. The era of great archaeological excavations began. Scholars obsessed with the past began to explore, literally, through the accumulated layers of history, looking for physical evidence of ancient worlds. And they found treasures. But not the kind of treasure they expected. In 1888, in a field in Sweden, farmers working the land discovered something strange. A ceramic vessel filled with silver coins. Not Swedish or even European coins. Coins with Arabic writing, minted in places with names no one recognized. Samarkand, Baghdad, cities of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was a Viking treasure buried 1,000 years earlier, containing riches from a world that seemed impossible to connect with Scandinavia. Archaeologists were perplexed. One or two coins could be coincidence, but thousands, tens of thousands. As more treasures were discovered in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Russia, a pattern emerged. There was a massive connection between Northern Europe and the medieval Islamic world that no one in modern history had clearly noticed. Imagine the excitement of these first archaeologists holding silver coins in their hands, seeing Arabic inscriptions, slowly realizing they were looking at physical evidence of an entire world of interactions that written history had partially forgotten. It was like discovering a lost continent, not geographically lost, but lost in humanity's collective memory, and the coins were just the beginning. As excavations continued, more evidence emerged. Pieces of silk fabric in Viking tombs, silk that could only have come from Asia via Islamic trade routes. Glass beads with Arab manufacturing techniques, fragments of Persian ceramics in Scandinavian settlements. Each artifact was a small piece of an enormous puzzle, and slowly, patiently, archaeologists began to assemble this puzzle, reconstructing connections that had been forgotten for 1,000 years. But the truly revolutionary breakthrough came when scholars rediscovered Arabic texts, especially Ibn Fadlan's account. Ahmad ibn Fadlan al-Hamadani had written his detailed account of the Rus in the year 922. The original manuscript was lost, but copies had survived, kept in libraries in Istanbul and other cities. For centuries, they were just another obscure text among thousands. But in the late 19th century, when Western scholars began systematically translating medieval Arabic texts, Ibn Fadlan's account was rediscovered, and it was a goldmine. Here was a cultured Arab observer, detail-oriented, sometimes surprised but always fascinated, describing firsthand the encounter between his world and the Volga Vikings. He described their physical appearances, their customs, their commercial practices. It was a direct window into a lost world. Did Ibn Fadlan imagine, as he wrote, that his words would survive for more than 1,000 years and become an invaluable historical source? With Arabic texts and European archaeological evidence, historians could finally reconstruct the complete story. The Volga routes weren't legend or exaggeration. They were historical reality, documented both in words and objects. And as the 20th century progressed, more discoveries continued. Excavations in Russia, especially after political changes that allowed more access to international archaeologists, revealed entire layers of medieval cities along the ancient commercial rivers. In some places, they could still find the remains of ports where Viking boats had docked, foundations of warehouses where goods had been stored, even mixed cemeteries where Vikings, Slavs, and steppe peoples had been buried side by side, physical evidence of truly multicultural communities. Each excavation added details. Scientific analyses of skeletons revealed diets, showing that some Vikings living in the south had adopted local dietary patterns, incorporating grains and preparations they never would have consumed in Scandinavia. DNA analysis began to reveal mixed marriages, women from one region marrying men from another, creating hybrid lineages. Modern science was revealing intimacies of lives lived 1,000 years ago, and each revelation made the past more human, more real, more understandable. But perhaps the most poetic discovery was the search for Itil. For decades, Russian archaeologists searched for the lost capital of the Khazars. They knew approximately where it should be, near the mouth of the Volga in the Caspian Sea. But geography had changed. The river had altered its course. Sediments had covered ancient ruins. Finally, in the early 21st century, using satellite technology and modern prospecting techniques, archaeologists identified a promising site. Preliminary excavations revealed remains of a large medieval city, layers of occupation showing different phases, artifacts from multiple cultures: Jewish, Islamic, Norse, Slavic. There's still debate whether it's really Itil. Archaeology is a cautious science that doesn't like hasty conclusions. But there's growing hope that yes, they finally found that cosmopolitan city that was the beating heart of the Volga routes. And if it's true, if they really found Itil, imagine what else they might discover. Perhaps buried structures containing artifacts, treasures documenting trade, maybe even inscriptions identifying individual people who lived and traded in that city more than 1,000 years ago. Each archaeological discovery doesn't just add facts, it changes how we understand the past. Before these discoveries, the dominant historical narrative saw medieval Europe as isolated, insular, dominated by feudal and religious structures, with little external contact beyond Byzantium and conflicts with Islam. Now we know the reality was much more complex. There were extensive trade networks connecting practically the entire known world. There were deep cultural exchanges. There were multicultural communities functioning, at least sometimes, centuries before the modern era. This changes our perspective, doesn't it? When we discover that our ancestors were more cosmopolitan, more connected than we thought, it challenges assumptions about linear progress and modern exceptionalism. Maybe we're not as unique as we imagine. Maybe the challenges of living in a multicultural world, of negotiating between different cultures, of building bridges across religious and ethnic differences. Maybe our medieval ancestors faced versions of the same challenges. And sometimes, at least for a few centuries, they managed to find ways to coexist. This isn't just academic history, it's a mirror where we can see reflections of our own times. And sometimes, in these reflections distorted by time, we can find surprising insights about our own challenges and possibilities. Archaeologists continue exploring. Historians continue analyzing texts. Scientists continue applying new technologies to ancient artifacts. And each year, our understanding of these medieval trade routes becomes richer, more detailed, more surprising. There are fascinating projects happening right now. International teams of archaeologists, Russian, Scandinavian, Arab, European, working together to map the ancient routes. Using LiDAR technology to find traces of paths and settlements hidden under vegetation. Analyzing isotopes in bones to track where people came from and where they traveled during their lives. Each new scientific technique opens new possibilities. Ancient DNA analysis can now reveal not just ancestry, but even health conditions people had, diets they followed, even kinship between individuals buried in different places. It's as if the dead are finally able to tell their own stories, not through words, but through the chemistry preserved in their bones. And there's also the work of linguists, tracing words that traveled between languages. Each borrowed word is evidence of contact, of communication, of moments where two people from different cultures managed to understand each other enough to share concepts. Some of these words survive to this day in modern languages, carrying unconscious memories of encounters 1,000 years ago. When speakers of certain languages use particular words, some linguists can trace their origins to medieval contact between different worlds. And some words in Turkic languages still carry echoes of Norse origin. They're linguistic fossils, preserving moments of communication between worlds. And here's something hopeful. The study of these medieval trade routes has itself become a multicultural project. Academics from countries that sometimes have political tensions find common ground studying this shared past. Because this history belongs to everyone. It's not European or Islamic or Russian history. It's human history about how our species builds connections across the most unlikely differences. And perhaps in this modern world that sometimes seems increasingly divided, there are important lessons in this rediscovered history. Lessons about the possibility of coexistence, about mutual benefits of open exchanges, about creativity that arises when different cultures meet with curiosity instead of apprehension. It's not romanticized history because we've seen the difficult aspects, the conflicts, the problematic practices, but it's history that shows that even very different people with distinct worldviews can find ways to work together when there's will and necessity. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of the Volga routes, not the silver coins or beautiful artifacts that fill museums, but the proof that bridges can be built, that borders can be crossed, that us and them are categories much more fluid than we often assume. Because in the end, those merchants, Vikings and Arabs, Khazars and Slavs, all the intermediaries and hybrids, weren't trying to make a grand political or cultural statement. They were simply living their lives trying to prosper, raising families, building businesses, navigating a complex world the best way they knew. And in the process, without heroic intention, they created something beautiful and lasting. They created proof that humanity, despite all our differences, has this remarkable capacity to connect, to learn, to create together. That capacity hasn't disappeared. It's still within us, waiting for the right conditions to flourish again. And knowing this history, knowing that our ancestors managed, at least for a time, to build bridges across enormous distances and profound differences, that can inspire us to try to do the same. Because if Vikings and Arabs could find common language on the banks of the Volga 1,000 years ago, despite everything that separated them, what reason do we have, with all our technology and modern communication, not to try? Echoes in the present. What the Volga routes teach us today. We're reaching the end of this journey through time, from the frozen shores of the Baltic to the hot markets of Baghdad, following the footsteps of Vikings and Arabs who built bridges across the impossible. But before we say goodbye to these forgotten roots, it's worth asking, what does all this mean for us today? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about patterns that repeat, lessons that persist, possibilities we sometimes forget, but that remain available if we know where to look. The first lesson is perhaps the most obvious, but also the most frequently forgotten. Global connection is not a modern invention. We live in an age where we constantly talk about the global village, about how the internet and airplanes have connected the world in unprecedented ways. And it's true that the scale and speed of modern connections are unique, but the human impulse to connect, to trade, to learn across borders, that impulse is as old as civilization itself. Those Vikings descending the Volga in their dracars were doing a medieval version of globalization, connecting distant economies, creating exchange networks that crossed continents, building multicultural communities in unlikely places. And if they managed to do this with primitive technology, or wooden boats, star navigation, communication through translators, imagine what's really possible with the tools we have today. But there's also a warning in this story, because we've seen how fragile these connections were, how conflicts, climate change, political instability, and simple lack of will could undo in decades what took centuries to build. The Volga routes didn't disappear due to a single catastrophe. They disappeared because multiple factors converged to make them less viable, and no one invested the necessary effort to keep them functioning against contrary winds. It's a reminder that connections between peoples and cultures require constant maintenance. They can't be taken for granted, and when they begin to unravel, the process can be faster than we imagine. Can you see parallels with our current world? How international connections that seemed permanent can become fragile when tensions resurge, when differences deepen, when mutual trust is eroded. Second lesson: identity is more fluid than we generally assume. On the Volga routes, we saw people who were simultaneously multiple things: Vikings who spoke Arabic and participated in Muslim communities, Arabs who married Norse women and raised hybrid children, Jewish Khazars mediating between Christians and Muslims, cultural intermediaries who belong to all worlds and none completely. In our time, we often think of identity as fixed, singular, defined. You're from here or from there. You belong to this culture or that one. Borders are clear, categories are rigid, but the history of the Volga routes shows this is artificial simplification. Identities have always been negotiated, hybrid, contextual. People have always lived between worlds, incorporating multiple influences, creating unique syntheses. And perhaps instead of seeing this as a problem or threat to cultural purity, we should recognize it as a source of creativity and innovation. Because it was precisely these hybrid people, the cultural intermediaries, who made possible the trade and exchange of ideas that enriched everyone involved. Third lesson: trade is more than economics. When Vikings and Arabs met in the markets of Itil or Bulgar, yes, they were exchanging furs for silver, but they were also exchanging stories, techniques, ideas, perspectives. They were learning that the world was larger than they imagined. They were discovering that others weren't so different after all. Trade creates interdependence. And interdependence, when it works well, creates incentives for peace and cooperation. Not because people suddenly become altruistic, but because harming your trading partner is harming yourself. Of course, this isn't a guarantee against conflict. We saw tensions on the Volga routes too, but it creates structures where cooperation is more advantageous than confrontation most of the time. In a modern world where geopolitical tensions sometimes seem to be increasing, it's worth remembering that deep economic connections between different peoples aren't just about profit. They're about creating a fabric of relationships that makes conflict less likely and peace more sustainable. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me, Fourth lesson: knowledge preservation matters deeply. Ibn Fadlan wrote his account in the 10th century. If his words hadn't been copied, preserved, eventually translated and studied, we would lose an invaluable window into this lost world. All the wealth of detail about the encounter between Vikings and Arabs would have disappeared, leaving only silence and speculation. This reminds us that knowledge is fragile. Texts deteriorate, languages change, memories are lost. Each generation needs to make a conscious effort to preserve and transmit what it knows, or risks everything being forgotten. And in our digital age, where information seems infinite and permanent, it's easy to forget this fragility. But digital formats are also fragile in their own way. They depend on technologies that change, on servers that can fail, on platforms that can disappear. What stories of our time will survive for 1,000 years? What evidence will we leave for future scholars? These are questions we should ask more frequently. Fifth lesson: deep differences don't need to be insurmountable. Vikings and Arabs had almost everything different: religion, language, climate, food, values, worldview. It was hard to imagine two more distinct groups meeting, and yet they found ways to communicate, negotiate, cooperate. Not because these differences disappeared or were minimized, but because both sides decided that the benefits of connecting outweighed the discomforts of dealing with the different. This required pragmatism, flexibility, curiosity. It required being willing to learn different languages, to tolerate practices that seemed strange, to find common ground amid vast differences. It wasn't always easy or pleasant. There were cultural shocks, misunderstandings, sometimes tensions. But for 2 centuries, it worked well enough to create something extraordinary. And if they succeeded, what reason do we have not to try? Are our contemporary differences, political, religious, cultural, really deeper than those that separated a pagan Viking warrior from a devout Muslim merchant? Or have we simply lost the art of pragmatic compromise? Sixth lesson: complex systems can transform surprisingly fast. The Volga routes took generations to develop fully. Decades of trial and error, of gradual trust building, of establishing informal norms and institutions. It was a complex and sophisticated system maintained by thousands of people making millions of small individual decisions. And then, in a few decades, it lost its centrality. Not from a single catastrophe, but from an accumulation of pressures the system couldn't absorb. It's a reminder about the fragility of complex structures. They seem solid, permanent, until suddenly they're not. And when they begin to transform, the process can accelerate in unexpected ways. This has implications for our own systems: economic, political, environmental. What seems stable today may be more fragile than we realize, and preventive maintenance, even when it seems unnecessary, can be critical to avoiding abrupt later transformations. Seventh, and perhaps most important lesson: ordinary people make history. The history of the Volga routes isn't primarily about kings or caliphs, though they appear. It's about anonymous merchants carrying their goods upriver, about unknown translators facilitating communication, about blacksmiths adapting techniques, cooks experimenting with spices, musicians mixing melodies. It's about thousands of ordinary people making individual decisions that, aggregated, changed the world. None of them probably thought they were making history. They were just living their lives, seeking opportunities, trying to support their families. But cumulatively, they created something extraordinary. They proved it's possible to build bridges between cultures. They left a legacy that lasts 1,000 years later. This is hopeful. It means we don't need to wait for great leaders or massive movements to create change. Each interaction between people from different cultures, each moment of genuine curiosity instead of apprehension, each choice to cooperate instead of confront, All this accumulates. And who knows, maybe 1,000 years from now, future scholars will look at our time and see patterns we don't notice. They'll see how ordinary people, through millions of small choices, built or let bridges fall apart. And hopefully, they'll write about us with the same fascination we feel for the merchants of the Volga routes. Because in the end, history isn't just what happened, it's also an invitation to imagine what can still happen. The Volga routes existed, flourished, and eventually lost centrality, but they proved it was possible, and if it was possible once, it can be possible again. Maybe not trade routes exactly. The world has changed too much, but other forms of connection across deep differences, other ways to build communities that transcend borders, other bridges between worlds that seem too distant to touch. The spirit of those first Vikings rowing into the unknown, of those Arab merchants venturing into the frozen north, of those cultural intermediaries living between worlds. That spirit didn't die. It still lives in anyone willing to cross borders, literally or figuratively, to meet and understand the other. And maybe that's the true heritage of the Volga routes. Not coins or artifacts, but living proof that it's possible, that it was done before, so it can be done again. That humanity, in its best moments, is capable of extraordinary things when it chooses curiosity over apprehension, connection over isolation, cooperation over conflict. That possibility never disappeared. It's waiting. It always has been. The whisper of forgotten roots, a final reflection. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. From the frozen forests of Scandinavia to the hot deserts of Mesopotamia, we followed in the footsteps of people who dared to cross the unknown. People who transformed the impossible into the everyday, who built bridges where there was only distance. Now, as our story approaches silence, it's worth pausing for a moment and simply feeling the weight of these centuries of encounters. Close your eyes if you want. Take a deep breath and imagine. Imagine the sound of oars cutting through the dark waters of the Volga. The constant rhythm, almost hypnotic, of dozens of men rowing in sync. The whisper of wind in the sails when there was wind. The silence of the forests on the banks, mute witnesses to so many journeys. Imagine the smell of markets where worlds met. Spices mixed with the odor of tanned furs. Arab incense floating over the aroma of Nordic pine. The metallic smell of silver being weighed and traded, changing hands, crossing invisible borders between cultures. Imagine the sensation of the first winter an Arab merchant spent in the north, the cutting cold that penetrated to the bones, so different from the dry heat he was accustomed to. And the first summer a Viking spent in the south, the enveloping heat, the constant sun, the air that seemed to carry 1,000 unknown aromas. Each of these moments was real. Each was lived by people as real as us. With hopes and fears, with families and dreams, with all the complexity that characterizes human experience. And what did they leave us? Not just coins and artifacts, though these are precious, not just texts and accounts, though these are invaluable. What they really left us was something deeper, more subtle, but also more important. They left us a memory of possibility. Memory that worlds that seem impossible to connect can, in fact, touch and create something beautiful. Memory that deep differences don't need to inevitably lead to conflict. Memory that ordinary people, through courage and curiosity, can change the course of history. This memory lives in languages that still carry words borrowed from those encounters. It lives in the architecture of churches that unconsciously incorporate elements from multiple traditions. It lives in the stories we tell, in the routes we follow, in the ways we think about ourselves and the world. And it lives, perhaps most importantly, as a possibility we can choose to remember or forget, because here's the thing about history: it's not just a fixed and immutable past, it's also a living resource we can use to imagine different futures. When we know something was possible once, it becomes a little easier to believe it can be possible again. The Volga routes show us that global connection is neither inevitable destiny nor modern invention. It's a choice humans make repeatedly throughout history. The choice to open up or close off, to connect or isolate, to learn from the different or fear it. And this choice is never made just once. It's made every day, in millions of small interactions, by ordinary people living their lives. Every time we choose curiosity instead of apprehension when we meet someone different, every time we decide to learn a word in another language, try food from another culture, listen to a story from a different perspective, every time we build a small bridge instead of erecting a wall, we're making the same choice those merchants made 1,000 years ago. And these choices matter, not immediately, not dramatically, but cumulatively over time. They shape the world we live in. The Vikings who first descended the Volga didn't know they were starting something that would last centuries. The Arab merchants who first traveled to the frozen north didn't foresee the deep cultural exchanges that would result. They were just taking one step at a time, one decision at a time, and gradually, step by step, they built something extraordinary. We have the same capacity, the same possibility before us. Today's world is different, more connected in some senses, perhaps more fragmented in others. But the fundamental choice remains the same. We can choose to see differences as threats or as opportunities. We can choose to build bridges or walls. We can choose curiosity or apprehension. And whatever choice we make, individually and collectively, it will accumulate. It will shape the world we leave for the next generations. It will determine whether future scholars look at our time as a moment of opening or closing, of connection or fragmentation. What a journey, isn't it? If you enjoyed traveling with us, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. So as we say goodbye to the Volga routes, as we leave behind those courageous merchants and those cosmopolitan cities, we take with us a simple but profound truth. It's possible. It's possible to cross immense distances and deep differences. It's possible to build understanding where before there was only strangeness. It's possible to create beauty in the meeting of different worlds. It's not easy. It never was. It requires courage, patience, willingness to feel uncomfortable sometimes. It requires recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that other cultures have wisdom we can learn. It requires humility to admit when we're wrong and flexibility to change when necessary, but it's possible. It was proven 1,000 years ago on the banks of a river in Eurasia. And it can be proven again today, tomorrow, anywhere people choose to try. The physical roots of the Volga lost their centrality, covered by changes and oblivion, but the metaphorical route, the possibility of connection through difference that never disappeared, it's always there, waiting to be rediscovered by each new generation. And perhaps, in the end, that's the most important lesson of all. That possibility doesn't die. It can be forgotten, ignored, set aside, but it doesn't die. It waits patiently for those willing to pick it up again and see where it leads. So as you close your eyes and let sleep come, take with you this image, a long boat gliding smoothly through calm waters. Inside it, people from different worlds rowing together in the same direction, the stars above reflected in the water, illuminating the path. And ahead, beyond the horizon, infinite possibilities waiting to be discovered. The world is vast. The differences are real, but bridges are possible. They always were. They always will be. Good night, sleep well, and dream of routes not yet discovered, of encounters not yet realized, of bridges not yet built, because the journey continues. It always continues, and who knows, maybe tomorrow or someday soon, you'll find your own version of the Volga routes, your own moment of crossing borders, of connecting worlds, of discovering that the impossible is, in fact, just the not yet attempted. And when that moment comes, remember the Vikings and Arabs who came before. Remember their courage, their curiosity, their willingness to try despite all the uncertainty, and then take a deep breath and take the first step. The Volga is waiting. It always has been.